You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
This is the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I am your host, Andy Tanner. Great job tuning in and listening. I congratulate our listeners all the time because many people don't invest time to learn. And a podcast is an easy way, either on your commute or just relaxing, to keep up to date. So great job being here. We have another great program on deck. We've had Ted Siedle on the program before, and since we had him before, he's been a busy guy. He got together with one of my great friends, Robert Kiyosaki. They co-authored a book called Who Stole My Pension? How you can stop the looting, and it is looting that's going on. He also, Ted is like a forensic guy, right? He does forensics on investment management securities. In fact, he's kind of pioneered the field of forensic investigation on money management. And so Benchmark is his firm, Benchmark Financial Services. His website is Benchmark Alert. You can go to Amazon.com, pick up Who Stole My Pension. Fascinating reading. So with that, and there's a lot of other credentials we could go through, but with that, Ted, thank you so much for coming back to the Cash Flow Academy podcast, man. It's good to be with you again.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, Ted, you and I have had a chance to talk a couple of times on my podcast. And then we did a Rich Dad radio show, probably 2-3 months ago, I guess it's been, where you and I had the chance to talk. And my book, 401 Chaos, talks about the difficulty with people that do contribution plans. Your book with Robert, Who Stole My Pension, talks about the problems with the pension. So it seems like retirement it's just getting attacked on all sides here. So what's the state of the union? What are you seeing right there with coronavirus and all the stuff going on? What do you see? Bring us a big picture of what you see with pensions right now, out of the gate.
Well, the thing to keep in mind about pensions is we've had the historic 11-year bull market, the longest bull market in the history of this country. And even with that tremendous market performance, pensions were failing, struggling, underperforming. So now, with coronavirus being the newest cause of the downturn to the market, of course, we had the dot-com bubble, then we had the
subprime,
the subprime financial crisis of 2008, and now we have this coronavirus. So the real issue is, if 11 years historic bull market did not improve the solvency of our nation's pensions, what do you think is going to happen now that we've been smashed with this coronavirus national emergency? So as far as pensions go, pensions are in a real state of crisis. They're really going to be challenged, and starting most government pensions work off of fiscal year end, so they'll be reporting their performance after the summer.
Yeah, it is a big issue. Let's talk about this field of forensic investigations of money management. To me, forensics, I don't know what the root word is or what that word means, but when I hear the word forensic, it means, okay, we're going to find out what happened. We're going to analyze some situation, whether it's a, forensics lab for DNA or a crime scene or whatever. We're just going to go figure out what happened. So I don't know if that's a correct evaluation of the word forensic, but that's what you do. And here's a question. It's pretty simple. And you set that up beautifully, because the context is, you're right. We have the greatest 11-year bull market in the history of the markets. I mean, never this long or this much prosperity in the history of the stock market. So that tells me the money was made. Okay, the money, it did grow. It isn't a figment of our imagination. The prices did go up. The accounts should have swelled. So if you have this huge prosperity that people bank on when they invest in the stock market broadly, as a broad market, here's my question. In your investigations, where'd the money go? Where'd it go? If it's not in the pensions, it doesn't just disappear. So where'd the money go?
Where do you think it went?
Well, I think it went to fees. That's what I think.
went to Wall Street. The money was made, but the money went to Wall Street. So with many of these investments, you can see fees as high as 6% a year. And this is an example I'm working on right now of a pension, a city pension. The fees were on this fund-to-funds investments were 6% a year for the last 10 years. And the pension fund made 4% a year net. So you asked me, where'd the money go? 6% went to Wall Street, 4% went to the pensioners. And that's what's happened all around the nation. Since the 2008 meltdown, our nation's pensions migrated into high risk, high cost, the highest risk, highest cost, most secretive investments ever devised by Wall Street, such as hedge funds, private equity, and venture funds, and fund-of-funds. So what happened was they got into all these investments right as the market was soaring, and because of the fees and other abuses, they underperformed the market over the last 11 years, paid tons of fees to Wall Street, underperformed the market, and that's why they are actually in worse condition even after this 11-year historic bull market. And by the way, a lot of people ask me about, what does forensic mean? What does it involve? And there are really two meanings of the word forensic, and one being that you're applying scientific methods to investigate a crime or an issue. But what it also means is of evidence of a quality to be submitted to a court of law. So that's what I do. I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm also forensic background, is I investigate failing investments or pensions using established sort of scientific methods that will be acceptable to a court of law. And what we find is that often when pensions fail or flounder, there are conflicts of interest, hidden and excessive fees, and violations of law that have caused it. It's not simply as a result of unpredictable, unforeseen market forces. It's because of various forms of wrongdoing.
It really is astounding that people don't understand how compounding costs work. And I think we can do people a great service if we can give them that context just a little bit here. I'm looking at a spreadsheet on my computer right now where I've done a little compounding exercise. You might find this interesting to comment on. I used an old John Bogle example, the late John Bogle. And I start out with a guy who's 20 years old, and I start out with $1,000, and I don't add to it. We just compounded at 8%, and the market did better than 8% in that 11-year span, but we'll just go with 8%. And if you take that $1,000 and you compound it over your life from age 20 to 65 when you die, you get about $388,000 total. That's how much money was made. If you take a 2.5%, not the 6 you mentioned, the 2.5% out of that, and you give it to Wall Street, you're going to wind up with about 184, and they're going to wind up with 204. Which is just astounding to me. That's if they're taking, just a minimal amount. For every time they up a basis point, I don't think people understand it can take a quarter, a third, a half of that pie, and even more than 50% of that pie as they go along. For example, if you take those compounding costs and you just look at it year over year, you're actually going to find that they get the lion's share of the money through this idea of compounding costs. And my question for you is this. On the one hand, those fees are in the fine print, and someone who's not educated says, well, 6%, that doesn't sound like much, especially since I'm getting, this high quality Wall Street hedge fund expertise. I'll pay 6%. That gives me 94, right? I mean, great. But on the other hand, you have this fiduciary responsibility for those guys to put, the people they serve first, and yet they're making most of the money. So, from a legal standpoint, there's no question that Wall Street got the money and the pension funds didn't. There's no question where that money went. That's pretty easy to see with basic math. But how do you deal with that from a fiduciary responsibility, where does the law, what does the law say in terms of, they're allowed to charge fees, right? The SEC has certain parameters for hedge funds that they have to work within. And as long as they're working within those hedge funds, is it the responsibility of the investor to know the fees, or is it the responsibility of Wall Street to lower them? How do you feel about that?
Well, getting back to your first issue, which was the effect of compounding, your average state and local pension is 70% funded. So if you assume excessive fees of, let's say you're paying fees of 1% a year more than you should, which is very common. 1% over a 30-year period without compounding is 30%, right?
Yeah.
And with compounding, it's much greater. So if you want to know why state pension funds and local pension funds are 70% funded, just look at the impact of even a 1% excessive fee per year. That explains well over, that easily explains the 30% underfunding. So there is the effect of excessive fees is tremendous over a worker's lifetime, over, say, a 30-year period, as you pointed out in the 401k example. But the Wall Street generally is allowed to charge any fee it wants, but the question, and of course, fiduciaries to a pension are responsible to establish that the fees are reasonable. That's part of their fiduciary duty. So the question generally comes down to, were the fees properly disclosed? Were the fees, and were the fees legal, legitimate, whatever? So it's in the forensic investigation that you answer the question of whether Wall Street met its obligation to properly disclose the fees. And more often than not, with the more complex, less transparent investments, Wall Street fails. They do not fully disclose all the fees, all the conflicts of interest, all of the potential illegalities. So when you get right down to it, when you actually analyze, you typically find that Wall Street has not properly disclosed the fees, or the fees are otherwise illegitimate.
So what happens with all this, and by the way, it's the same with 401ks, okay? It's no different. And you can play the blame game, and this happens all the time. Look, the rapist needs to go to jail, 100%. And we have this idea of victim blaming. Says, well, she walked home wearing a short skirt in a bad neighborhood. There's no room for victim blaming. A rapist is a rapist. On the other side of that coin, if my son goes to Vegas when he's of age and he loses all his money on the crap table, do I blame him or do I blame Vegas? So the blame game is kind of tough because we're trying to find out who the victim is. And I look at KRS, right? I look at Kentucky Retirement System when you worked on this case, and that's just a train wreck, okay? And I'm looking at these state legislatures, and I think about the qualifications to run for state legislature. You put a sign in a bunch of people's yards, and you're in the good old boys club, and you get in. It's just much different than being a senator. Being a state legislature is much different than being a U.S. senator. And I'm looking at some of the documentaries and some of the stuff on Frontline did. I'm like, these guys are not very smart. Like, these people at KRS aren't even very smart, and the legislators aren't very smart. And here they hand their money over because it's called the Daniel Boone Fund. It's a fund of funds. It's killing me. Let's invest in the Daniel Boone Fund. And there's all these fees, and now they're saying, well, Wall Street took it. What is the responsibility of the investor to take care of his or her own money? At the end of the day, look, I can raise my children the way I want to raise them, or I can give them to daycare. And I can say, now listen, daycare, you behave yourself and do daycare well. But they're never going to do it as well as I can. They're not going to love them like I can. They've got their own business to run. They love their own kids more than mine. What's your opinion? I'm not asking for forensic evidence. I'm just asking for your opinion. Who's in charge of the money?
Yeah, that brings me to a number of the topics that we discuss in the book, Who Stole My Pension, that I did with Robert Kiyosaki. But one of the key chapters, chapter 8, is called "Your Pension is Being Mismanaged." Mm-hmm. And basically what I say in the book is that when you look at pensions. They are so almost universally mismanaged. And I call that gross malpractice generally practiced. Now, why is that? Well, that's Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the people overseeing your pension lack investment experience.
Yeah.
Throughout the nation, and this is generally true also of corporate pensions and pensions globally, but throughout the country, public pension boards are made up of individuals that from the community that have no investment experience. There is hardly a state, city, county in this country that requires even one member of the board to have any relevant experience. So
they can't see these fees coming anyway, is what you're saying. They wouldn't recognize the law of compounding costs if they saw it, because they didn't.
No, I mean, you're talking about one of my good friends in Chicago was a kindergarten teacher who was on the board of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. And he told me, he said, Ted, I don't know the difference between a stock and a bond.
Oh, my hell.
I teach kindergarten. So these people are not savvy when it comes to investing. And, of course, with $4 trillion in assets, they are the perfect, sucker for Wall Street to sell investments to.
Don't leave that point too quickly, because you just brought up a great point. Is the most important three letters on Wall Street are AUM. They live and die, wake and sleep on assets under management. And so as you go out to say, okay, we want assets under management, you say, where's the money at? It's in 401ks and pensions, and they're just huge accounts to land. Could you speak about the competitiveness to land those accounts?
Yeah, it's huge money, and that's why there are very lavish public pension conferences that are underwritten by Wall Street. I've attended hundreds of them, everywhere from Saipan to Puerto Rico. All over the world, these conferences are held at lavish resorts, and Wall Street pays to bring these public pension board members, cops, firefighters, school teachers, to have the time of their lives at these resorts, and they sell that's how they market.
Yeah, not to mention the kickbacks you may find, right? As a forensic investigator, there's kickbacks, right?
There are kickbacks, but the truth is that you don't need to give a public pension board member a sack full of cash to get them to vote for your investment. It is just as effective, if not far more effective, to just take them out to dinner to Ruth Chris, 10 times in a row and ply them with alcohol. So what people often think is that there are these big, bags of money being exchanged under the table, but more often than not, it's
Ruth
just
Chris
whining,
Jeez.
dining. Yeah, that kind of thing.
It's unbelievable. Let's talk about this. So now it goes to court, and everyone there's no money left, so who's at fault? It goes to court, and then we sue, and then we talk about filing for bankruptcy. And, Mitch McConnell, you wrote an article in Forbes that we should mention. Everyone should go read it. It's already been read by just hundreds of thousands of people have been downloading this article you wrote in Forbes. Talk about Mitch McConnell and what he said about this. I mean, because now we have to decide legally. Look, Hostess can declare bankruptcy with Chapter 11. Detroit can declare bankruptcy in Chapter 9. Now, what's Mitch McConnell saying about, different people being able to, can you declare bankruptcy as a pension fund, stuff like this? Talk a little bit about Mitch and what you wrote about in this Forbes article.
Yeah, I wrote this article 4 days ago called Kiss Your State Pension Goodbye on Forbes, and it's already gotten almost 350,000 readers in that short period of time. And what Kentucky senior senator and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said was that he gave an interview where he said he was in favor of allowing states to use the bankruptcy route to basically ignore their promises to state pensioners. That would be a radical change in the nation, in the federal bankruptcy law. But he's in favor of allowing that to happen. And of course, Kentucky, his home state, has the worst funded pension in the country, only 16% funded, which will probably fall below 10% funding.
With the coronavirus pullback, yeah.
Coronavirus. So it sounds like he's positioning for his state pension to be the first to break its promises to state workers.
This is interesting because the consumers are almost in favor of bankruptcy. I got to declare bankruptcy and I can't pay my credit card debt, right? And you think, well, the big banks can afford it. Well, that turns the tables, doesn't it, Ted, a little bit, where now you're the one that's owed the money and they're defaulting on you. You're on the other side of that bankruptcy where the money you were owed, it's just not getting you paid, and guess what? There's nothing you can do about it, right?
Well, if this were to go through, yeah there would be nothing to do about it. But it will certainly be subject to a lot of litigation before it does go through. And I don't think it stands much of a chance. But this just, makes the point, which is, again, in the book, that if you are counting on a pension to provide for your retirement benefits, you had better watch that pension like crazy, like a hawk, because there are people out there who are intent upon stealing your pension for you. Simply waiting, sitting back, expecting the check to come in the mail every month is not a viable strategy. That is not a risk you can take.
I hope that's a context shift for people, that instead of seeing their pension as this nice little fund of money that's theirs, they should really say, oh, my pension's a frickin' steak dangled in front of the wolves of Wall Street. That's what my pension is. It's part of a whole bunch of meat that those guys are after to collect fees from. That's how they see it. And I think the forensics bear that out. Huge. Can you talk a little bit about CalPERS? You look at, like, Illinois is in pretty big trouble. Kentucky's a train wreck. I think Rhode Island has some problems. But, CalPERS is different because of the sheer size. Like, you mentioned the 16% funding, which is just unspeakable in Kentucky, but Kentucky's not California. Can you talk about where you see California going with their state pensions?
Well, CalPERS, or the California Public Employees Retirement System, is the largest in the country. Last I saw, it was about $300 billion. I think it's closer to $400 billion now. But it is one of the better funded systems compared to, it's not on the top 10 list of worst funded pensions, let's put it that way, like Illinois or Connecticut or some of these others. But CalPERS has, at one point, decades ago, was considered the gold standard for pensions. It was supposedly the best run pension in the country, if not the world. But over the last 20 years or so, it has embarrassed itself time and time again. They've had one board member committed suicide, another one went to prison. I mean, it is just kickbacks, illegalities, scandal after scandal. So it is now, I consider it as an example of what not to do. It pays hundreds of millions a year in kickbacks to third-party placement agents, invests in all kinds of high-cost investments, and doesn't perform that well. One of the things I tell people is when it comes to investing, you don't get what you pay for. It's more like the difference between a Rolex and a Timex. Mm-hmm. A Rolex costs a lot more money, but doesn't tell time well. Timex costs a lot less money, but is great for telling time. It's a very accurate timepiece. So in investments, like in watches, the more you pay does not mean the more you get. And that's something people really keep in mind. Low-cost investing is always the way to go.
So you wrote a book with Robert Kiyosaki, and I've been friends with Robert for, a number of years, over a decade, and I've traveled the world with him. He's a master teacher. He's an interesting guy, and he's not like people think. He's very much a student. He loves the big picture. In your experience in writing this book with Robert, what's the biggest thing you learned from him?
Well, there are two major things I learned from Robert. Robert asked me to work on this book together, and the two things we agreed on were, one, we should tell stories. Mm-hmm. people, member stories. There's no better way to get a point across than to tell a story. And that's something Robert encouraged me to do. And that's something that in my speeches and over the course of my career, I've realized is true. That really resonated with me. The other thing he said was, Ted, let's look globally. Let's not just write this book about America's pensions. Let's look at the world's pensions. And I have on occasion looked at pensions in the Netherlands or Japan, but never for long. And so we did that in the book. I took a look at the Australian, the Japanese, all of the European pensions. And so those were the two. And of course, what I found was deeply disturbing because we, the United States, are the number one exporters, creators and exporters of toxic assets. We create the weapons of mass financial destruction that are sold globally. And many of these investments are only now making their way into foreign pensions. So that's very disturbing. These foreign pensions are gobbling up some of these toxic investments at a time where America's pensions are now showing that these investments were terrible investments.
Let's finish with this. I'm rewriting a second edition of my book, and I'm opening it a little bit differently than I did. It's still about education, but I'll throw this at you, Ted, and see what you think of it. There's two cultures you can choose from a number of cultures, but here's two to consider. There's the culture of advice, and there's the culture of education. And those are two different cultures. Wall Street would like to have you in the culture of advice because as long as you don't know anything and you're that kindergarten teacher who doesn't know what's going on, then the fox can raid the hen house much more easily. They can, communicate these fees in a way that's up for debate in the court, right? Instead of being straight out, they say, well, we said it, but we said it this way and in this light and blah, blah, blah. And the person who drives me nuts is the guy who says, well, what should I do with my money? They're asking for advice. Tell me what to buy. The culture of education is where I enjoy the journey I learn. And I think people have three choices. You can get a job with a pension and let the Wall Street people manage it. You can get a job that has a 401k and let Wall Street manage it. Or you can say, you know what, I'm going to set a course of independence. I'm just going to avoid those guys and take control of my own ship. Now, like you say, Timexes and Rolexes, you're paying different amount for different advice, but it takes time and effort to become financially educated. Some people don't want to do it. After writing this book, do you feel the solution is a government solution, or do you feel it's more on the individual to say, look, this is corrupt. It's your responsibility to say, yeah, you can't blame the rapist, but if you don't want to get raped, then be aware that there's a lot of rapists on this particular street called Wall Street. What do you think?
Well, a couple of points. First thing is I often say that Wall Street's solution to every problem is always pay us more fees.
Give us your money.
Yeah, we if you're a pension and you're underfunded, pay us triple the fees and we'll solve your underfunding problem.
And to your point, Ted, that's a good point too. And to your point, if you see that your sum isn't enough, they'll blame you retroactively for not having saved as much 10 years ago. True? You should have given us more 10 years ago. That's the 401k bit, right? You didn't save enough in your 401k. That's why it's low. You didn't give us enough. That's a good point, Ted. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
the other point that's often overlooked is when it comes to retirement plan, the investor does not have the final say. In a 401k, the plan sponsor, the employer, picks the investment options from which the investor can allocate money.
True.
He can pick. So you do not, if you're in a 401k, your employer is picking the, let's say, family of funds or the investment options, not you. And there's nothing you can do about that. You do not have the right under ERISA to petition to have lower cost funds or whatever, and a real estate fund included in your 401k. And of course, in the case of pensions, defined benefit plans, the participant likewise has no right to say how the pension should be managed. So in both cases, the retirement saver is at a disadvantage. It has limited rights, limited power to control the investment decision-making process. That's an important thing to keep in mind. I have been involved in lawsuits as a lawyer. I sued Walmart and a lot of other major 401k plans for excessive fees and general mismanagement. So it's a big problem at the largest plans. And if you're in a plan, a 401k plan, for example, that offers only high-cost retail actively managed funds, you're screwed.
Yeah. Yep.
You can do. The more power you can have in controlling your retirement assets, the better. But you have to, and you have to recognize, what are the drawbacks of each of these types of retirement plans, and then consider what would be the best option for you.
So the question on people's mind might be, well, if I want to start where to start, I'll tell you where to start. I would start by reading Who Stole My Pension? How You Can Stop the Looting by Robert Kiyosaki and our guest, Ted Siedle, today. And if you have a 401k, you can pick up my book, 401 Chaos. Both really good books on understanding this problem. And the key to solving a problem is understanding it in the first place. And there's some great problems and solutions in that book. Ted's website is benchmarkalert.com. You've been so gracious with your time, as you always are. I wish I had more time with you. Next time you're in town or I'm in your town, we really need to get past the coronavirus stuff and go have a steak together because we have so much to share. And I've just really enjoyed your insights as a forensic specialist that has really delved down into the details. I don't know anyone that understands this problem better than you, Ted. So any final words before it's time to say goodbye?
Well, my final words are that the kind of pension mismanagement and 401k mismanagement we're seeing is really the product of the last 30 years or so. So this is new stuff in the world of investing. This retirement planning paradigm is relatively new, and it's now pretty clear that there's some major structural flaws in all of these types of retirement plans. So the world is waking up, and the challenge for investors today is to read, become educated about the flaws in the retirement planning paradigm, and then to think going forward, what do you need to do to address what has been really this massive retirement plan failure?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. The irony of if you decide, well, let's just print more money and give it to them, well, the very money you give them loses value. So you steal a pension through printing. It's just whatever way you dice it, it's just been mismanaged. And my counsel is for people to take the bull by the horns. Ted and I, we're either Chicken Little or we're Paul Revere, Ted. We're either saying the sky is falling, or we're saying, hey, the redcoats are coming, better get your gun and better be ready to defend your family, at least your pension, because these numbers are real. These lawsuits are real, and the forensics are showing it.
The results are in, and it's been the baby boomers and others are really screwed when it comes to heading for their retirement. The message is clear. What to do about it is up to all of us to work, for individual and, group solutions. But the message should be clear that what has been going on for the past 30 years in the retirement planning community has been dead wrong, and it's time for a new approach.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it'd look like in a bad market instead of a bull market. It's just incredible. No wonder the Federal Reserve now, Janet Yellen was talking about saying, hey, we need to give the Fed power to buy equities. And this is a structural problem. We ought to have another podcast on this another day, Ted, because if you start pouring money into the equities market for the sake of pouring money in the equities market, it separates it from fundamentals. In other words, if you're a Warren Buffett investor, you're buying a company because you know how to analyze it, you think it's a good company, and you go with it. But if you're a fund manager, you're not that good, and you say, look, let's just buy a whole bunch and diversify, hope winners. That means a lot of money's going into substandard companies because they're just hoping the winners outnumber the losers. And even when they win, the fees are so huge. There's a lot of structural problems in this just in terms of investing, because technically you're putting money in and having a technical chart pattern change, but fundamentally there's no reason to put money in a lot of those companies. So we'll have to talk again about not only the illegal part of what has happened, but just the basic flaw in the structure and what it's done to investing. And one of my favorite parts of this interview, Ted, is when you talked about the kindergarten teacher having to make decisions about pensions. Look, most people aren't smart enough to do this. And so that's the financial ignorance on both the investor and the middleman, like the people at KRS. It's astounding. So I thank you for your time. You've been more than liberal with it, and I hope you'll come back and give us updates from time to time on what you find.
Be happy to do it, and stay safe.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ted. You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm Andy Tanner. Hope you enjoyed our conversation with Ted Siedle. He has more insight and more experience in this problem than really anyone I know. And so I hope you take that to heart and found it valuable. And if you feel inspired to increase your financial education, well, my word, that's what we do at the Cash Flow Academy. We've always got all kinds of information, classes of all ranges and types. And so drop by and see us at Cash Flow Academy. This has been Andy Tanner. I'm your host of the Cash Flow Academy podcast, where investing is made simple. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.